Governor's State of the State message are the Senate President, John Russo, and the Assembly Minority Leader, Alan Karcher. And gentlemen, what did you think of Tom Kean's State of the State message?
Well, I thought his past messages were far more inspiring, and I had occasion to publicly say so. Perhaps because this is an election year, he chose to avoid some of the tough issues, repeated some of the old ones, didn't offer any solutions to the urban problems, came up with some proposals such as the authority on the shore area, something I frankly don't understand yet. Probably was not one of his better speeches. I had hoped for more. I thought that because now he's not up for re-election again, he's a popular governor, I thought this was the chance for this governor to really make a mark in history, to be a real statesman. I thought his prior speeches were much better. I was not inspired by this one. I think he could have done better.
Assemblyman Karcher.
I think it was disappointing because, as the senator says, he missed the opportunity to be aggressive and to be ambitious and to lay out the kind of agenda that we would hope for in this state, and one that would set the priorities right. It's rather remarkable in the things it ignored. If there's one crisis in this state right now, it is in the urban centers, who are facing the nightmare of what has happened with the cutbacks in federal funds, and laying off policemen and firemen, and that was not spoken of at all. We have a problem, and saying problem is being polite, it's really a crisis as well with solid waste and what's going to be done with that. Last year he spent a great deal of time talking about the Division of Motor Vehicles and how it was going to be solved. You notice he was remarkably silent upon the progress of that. The fact is that the division is probably in worse trouble this year than it was last year when he spent so much time saying he was going to cure that problem. There are three major problems that cry out for immediate attention, and yet the governor chose not to even mention them.
Let's take some of the points that the governor brought up on his speech, and you can respond to them point by point. Welfare reform. That the governor was talking about, this REACH program, which would require people to either take a job, undertake job training, or some educational program in order to collect their welfare check. What's your reaction
That might be
to
one
that?
of the bright spots. Democrats in the Assembly were delighted by it. Last summer, in July of last year, we had recommended that very approach, what we call a multidimensional approach, knowing that you cannot just attack the welfare problem and getting people off the welfare rolls and into decent jobs by going at it only from one direction. You have to do it on a multidimensional level. You have to talk about daycare. You have to talk about transportation. You have to talk about education. You have to talk about the health problems that are associated with many people who are welfare recipients and curing those. We recommended that very strongly last summer. We came out with our issue paper precisely outlining what we recommended last week, and we're kind of happy that the governor's on board. We think that is probably the brightest spot in this whole message, is that he is adopting the Democratic proposal.
Senator Russo.
I would basically agree. We too welcome the governor. The Senator Costa program has been pending in the Senate now for some months. Hearings have been held in Senator Cody's Institutions Committee. It's basically the Massachusetts program that the governor's advocated. It's the Costa program in the Senate. We're ready to vote on it very shortly. We think it's a good one.
Does the cost of this program, which by the time, if it is fully implemented 3 years down the line, could become very expensive, $50, maybe $100 million, is that something that is too costly, or does that bother you at all? It sounds like you're both really, there's agreement with both of you and the governor's office on this.
The alternative is more costly. The alternative of sort of abandoning people to a life of welfare and cycles of welfare, generation after generation, is much more costly. The governor's right and said exactly what we've said, the Democrats have said all along, is that this program, if we copy the good example of Governor Dukakis up in Massachusetts, we can have a program that pays for itself. And we're very optimistic that if it's done the way that both the Senate and the Assembly Democrats have outlined, it will pay for itself.
In his State of the State message, where he drew, I think, his loudest applause was when he called for, once again, the passage of the verbal threshold bill, which he says will bring down automobile insurance rates. Just yesterday, the Assembly passed legislation to do just that. It is now in your House, Senator Russo. What's going to happen?
Well, first of all, you should understand the applause didn't come from a nonpartisan group. Most of them were on the state payroll that were here today, along with the legislators. So I think the difficulty there is, you know, What the governor basically proposed in the verbal threshold, I think he said it would save $200 million. I'm not sure that I accept that. I think what he meant was it would increase insurance industry profits by $200 million by taking away rights of people to bring suit. This is something that there's a great deal of difficulty on the part of the Senate. And I don't mean the Democrats in the Senate, I don't mean the Republicans in the Senate, I mean members of both parties who don't feel that the verbal threshold will do any more other than increase insurance industry profits. There's a legitimate disagreement on that issue. You know, the Senate had the Dalton Committee had some 6 months of hearings. We came up with a program that I think made a lot of sense, including an optional verbal threshold, allowing the consumer to decide whether he wants the verbal threshold instead of forcing him to take it. The Assembly didn't give it much consideration. We think that there's a difference of opinion on that issue, that we ought to do our best to get something accomplished that will save the consumer some money. I wonder if the governor does want to accomplish part of the problem, or whether he'd rather keep the issue alive for political purposes. You know, the Senate and the Assembly are both up for election this year. I think the problem is not a partisan one. There's a legitimate difference of opinion. I think we ought to accomplish what we can and go on to other things and stop throwing stones at one another, as I think we have been on this issue.
Is the verbal threshold bill, is it dead in the Senate?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that. It's dead as long as it can't get 21 votes.
Can it get 21 votes?
So far, no. It would be far short of it on both sides of the aisle. There are many senators who just simply don't believe that the verbal threshold will save any significant premiums on the part of our consumers. Until at least 21 are convinced that it will, it's not going to pass. I don't know how long we want to just sit and wait, or should we go on and do something such as the Dalton bill that Senator Dalton's committee came up with that will accomplish at least part of the problem. It will save some sums of money without taking away any rights of people that are significant. It just depends on the point of view of the individual senators, Democrat and Republican. This is not necessarily a political issue. It's a difference of opinion as to what will save consumers money.
Perhaps one of the more controversial issues that will come out of this speech today will be the governor's call for this Shore Clean Ocean Authority, which some people have called a super authority, which could issue its own bonds and then have control over virtually all shore protection projects, be they federal, state, or local. What's your reaction to that? Is that going to fly in either one of the houses? Let me ask Alan Karcher that first.
Let me suggest that the governor talks about this, and I'm not so sure what he's talking about either. We have a number of agencies today on which we rely and who are doing a job, and if they're not doing it, we ought to force them to do it. The governor did mention about joining the suit. We in the Assembly had passed a resolution last year to have us join the suit against New York on having their garbage flowed over. We also have the Interstate Sanitation Commission that's involved in that. We have CAFRA. We have a number of agencies that are addressing this problem. I don't know what the governor has in mind by a super agency. I have a feeling, though, that it's just another bit of fluff, that it's not going to do anything that we are not in a position to do already. Well, we know what has to be done. The true problem with our ocean and the pollution we have there goes right back to the White House. The president, who we did not mention, vetoed the Clean Water Act. To the credit of the U.S. Congress, now they're making it a first priority. That's what we need. We need the money to build sewers in New Jersey. Until we have those sewers, we're going to have problems with people at the shore not wanting to vacation there. But the problem goes back to the White House and their veto of the Clean Water Act. Until we get that accomplished, until we have those money to construct the sewers we need, nothing's really going to be solved.
You know, another thing which is really unfortunate, I can't quite respond to your question because I don't know what the governor has in mind. You know, for the past year, I've worked closely with the governor, and we've gotten more things done than we ever have, I think, in 1 year. Even though there have been differences of opinion, we've accomplished a lot. We worked as partners. I don't know why, but that budget message that he delivered today, or I'm sorry, that State of the State message, I never saw until today. The media had it yesterday, but the Senate President didn't have it. I sat up here on the stage and listened to the message, while my colleague in the Assembly, the Republican leader, Speaker Hardwick, had a copy of the governor's speech. He followed along with it. I never had one. I never saw one. This Shore Authority you mentioned, I learned about today for the first time. I've got to find out more about it. I wish I could comment on it. I would say this, though. The governor earlier in his message talked about too much state regulation, and then later in the message proposed another authority with more regulation. I don't know which was the real Governor Kean talking, but I would have a lot of difficulty with another authority that's not answerable to either the legislature or to the public, creating more bureaucracy upon the shore areas and creating more of a roadblock to those communities. I think there's going to be revolution along the shore if it's what I suspect it is, but I don't know if it is because I didn't see or hear about it until today.
While we're talking about the shore issues, the governor again called for the passage of the Gormley-Villain Natural Resources Protection Act, which would be funded by the realty transfer tax. What is your response to that?
Well, I'm particularly disappointed he did that today, not because I don't, he has always advocated that position, but you know, on Thursday, we're having a meeting of all the particular people involved to try to work out a compromise. I asked the governor to join with us, and he agreed to. And here we are only 2 days before with the governor advocating a position, indicating in effect no compromise. I hope he didn't mean that, because again, you see what we had here today. That shore protection plan, the Gormley-Villain plan, which may be a good plan, it may not, imposes a realty transfer tax. The governor also advocated a gas tax increase of 5%. We had $250 million in tax increases today in that budget. The governor used an illustration about the person in Toms River who had an insurance increase this past year. I now have to, that's my hometown, I now have to tell those folks in Toms River that the governor would increase your gasoline tax by 5 cents a gallon, and they don't have any other way to travel in Toms River. There are no subways, there are no bus lines to speak of, there are no rail lines. Their gas tax is going up 5 cents a gallon. If they sell their home, they're going to have a realty transfer tax of maybe $50, $100, whatever the amount may be. These are the questions we have to answer. Are these necessary? They may be. But when we talk about insurance rates, we also have to talk about tax increases. And the governor today, rightly or wrongly, proposed $250 million or more of new tax increases today. We've got to take a hard look at that so we have answers for those folks in Toms River, Camden, Newark, Trenton, wherever, that are going to pay.
Let's talk about the gasoline tax increase proposal here for just a moment. When you talk about raising taxes, Assemblyman Karcher, although your party is in the minority in the Assembly, when it comes time for a tax vote, people look for a bipartisan vote there. Is that something that the Democrats in the Assembly can get behind?
I think it's much too early to tell. I think one of the things that people are troubled by is that the governor wants to rush into a new gas tax of $200 million a year. While at the same time we have an enormous surplus. We have a $500 million surplus according to the last reports I've seen. In Washington there is a deficit and they talk about tax cuts. Here we have a surplus and they talk about tax increases. It's a very, very strange kind of political picture we have when you think about it. I think people want to see these problems in the cities addressed first, because that's of crisis proportions. I think number two, they want to see where the last round of money went. I think there's a great deal of dissatisfaction, and if not dissatisfaction, an awful lot of head scratching, if you will, about where all that money went so fast and why it didn't go to the projects that it was promised to go to. I, for one, philosophically, I supported Brendan Burns. I was a sponsor of Brendan Burns' tax increase. I've never had a problem with, conceptually, taxing fossil fuel a little higher. What I do have a problem with is being rushed into it, being stampeded into it, without seeing where the money went to begin with and whether it was properly used. So I would like to see an audit, an independent audit of Highway Trust Fund or Transportation Trust Fund number 1. I think that would be a condition precedent to asking for support for a new round, especially one that's linked to a $200 million a year increase at the same time we have this $500 million surplus sitting here.
Senator Russo, last week the Speaker of the Assembly, Chuck Hardwick, said that before he would post the bill in the Assembly, he would want assurances from your House that you would pass the measure.
I hope he doesn't hold his breath too long, because the Senate is not going to be dictated to by the Assembly, if that's what he meant. We don't pass legislation by first asking the Assembly to give us assurances they're going to pass it. The Assembly never asked for any assurances from the Senate when it passed things they thought were popular. When the going gets tough, such as a tax increase, they want our assurances first. That's not the way the system runs. We're going to do our job in the Senate. I'm sure the Assembly will do theirs. I've said if they pass a tax increase, I've assured them I'll post it for a vote. I'm not committing myself to support it. I don't know how the Senate will vote on it. I'll keep an open mind on it. But we're not going to have the other house tell us or demand of us where we stand before they do their duty. We won't ask them to, or demand of them that they tell us where they stand before we do our duty. We've each got our responsibility. I'm confident we'll both do it. I don't think the Speaker really meant to say that.
Do you think the 5-cent tax hike has a chance in the Senate? Is it something that could pass this year?
Well, I think it could. I'm not sure it will. I know I always in the past, when Byrne was governor and when Kean proposed it before, I opposed it. I'll keep an open mind on it. If I'm convinced it's necessary and that I can go back to those folks I represent and tell them that, look, we have to pay this because it's needed for the state, I'll do it, even though it might be unpopular. But I'm going to have to be convinced of that first, and I will keep an open mind, and I won't make the judgment for the Senate unilaterally. I'll post the bill, even though I might be against it if I am, or I may support it.
Assemblyman Karcher, you watched today's speech with the mayors of some of New Jersey's cities. What was their reaction to what the governor had to say in terms of his urban aid plan, which basically the state will provide some seed money, but it will be the individual communities and the neighborhoods that will pull themselves up?
Well, let me tell you what their reaction was. They were extraordinarily disappointed. They cannot believe that the governor is talking about New Jersey when he paints this very glowing picture, because in their cities they are facing a major crisis. Every one of the mayors, and there were 35 of them down here today, all of whom expected to come and all of whom were turned away from this particular room because the governor had already packed the place with his political patriots, payroll patriots. So they could not even get in. They had to watch it on closed-circuit TV. They were a little annoyed at that, to say the least, but they were also annoyed that the governor did not address the crisis that they are having. Each one of them has reported that they are laying off police and firemen. I point that out because the governor is, and I'm not trying to disparage him, but he has to be dreaming if he thinks people are going to invest in neighborhoods in the cities when there's no policeman on the beat and when there's no firemen to protect that business. And that's what the mayors are facing. They are facing the fact that over the last weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, they've all had to send out layoff notices saying that the police and firemen, you're going to be laid off. We had a crime increase. The crime rate last year increased 10% with the drug epidemic. Another matter that the governor sort of glossed over. At the same time, we have this terrible drug epidemic. We have this terrible rise in crime. The governor is literally forcing these mayors, because he will not come to their assistance, to lay off police and firemen. They were extraordinarily disappointed.
Did you hear any numbers mentioned by some of the mayors?
Well, for instance, in some towns, in some cities, the entire workforce has gotten the 45-day notice, because I do not know how many they'll be able to keep. In my own district in Perth Amboy, about 150 notices have gone out to police and firemen in that city. And I think that's across the board. You have the city of Camden, 50% of the entire workforce, and that police, fire, sanitation, health inspectors, they've just gotten their notices. There's just no way to pay them. Cities are truly in crisis.
Senator Russo, you proposed taking part of this year's budget surplus and turn it back over to the cities, although the governor has stated that that money should go toward next year's budget. After what you've heard today, what are your plans in regards to your legislation?
Haven't changed one bit. That legislation has passed the Senate. It's pending in the Assembly. What that legislation involves is the governor has had said to us that he wouldn't sign any legislation giving more help to the towns of the state and the cities unless we showed where the money was coming from. Now, I respected that view. However, when we found out that the revenues from the sales tax and income tax were going to be $73 million higher than projected, now it's $100 million and some, it made sense to use some of that money to help these folks out so we can keep the property tax down. So I put the bill in. The governor responded that he wouldn't sign it because the following year we're going to be facing this deficit, he said, and we'll need this money. Well, I can't answer that. Governors, and not only Governor Kean, but Governor Byrne before him, have painted these pictures of gloom so that they could have a big surplus and look good. You can't answer that. That money is now there. The surplus is at least $100 million higher than he projected. We ought to use some of this money to replace the loss of revenue sharing so that the property tax can be held down. I won't say we can reduce it, but we can keep it from going up substantially. These people, they need that out there in the cities and in the towns, whether it be Toms River or Newark or wherever. They need that. We ought to do it. I'm going to keep trying to convince the governor we should.
Assemblyman Karcher, the urban, what you've called the urban crisis, seems to be your main concern in the response to the governor's message. What would you do to help the cities?
Well, we in the Assembly, first of all, we support Senator Russo's approach. And if the Speaker would just post that bill, there would be unanimous Democratic support for it. I want to say that, so that's crystal clear. Number two, what we have said is that our Assembly delegation has put forth a program that includes about $145 million program, all of which would be relief to the cities to do exactly what the Senator talked about. Bring down property tax increases, stabilize property taxes. And that would be by taking over the costs of municipal welfare, by restoring the loss in revenue sharing, by creating special programs to help our neediest cities. We have to remember that the cities in this state have the highest tax rates, extraordinarily high tax rates, and overall New Jersey has the highest property taxes in the entire nation. Something has to be done. We have already committed ourselves as a delegation, the 30 of us, that we would support for instance, we're on record as saying we would support repeal of the Marlene Lynch Ford bill if the money were dedicated to the cities for their use and it was a permanent program to stabilize property taxes. That's our program. We're committed to it. We're also open. Any other suggestion that the governor wants to make or Speaker Hardwick wants to make, we'd listen to. But we are committed, every one of us, all 30, to doing that program for the mayors.
Senator Russo, what's your response to that? I noticed you were listening quite closely there, particularly the appeal of the Marlene Lynch Ford tax bill, which some of the mayors have called for as a way of getting more money back to their communities.
Well, you may recall, Larry, I joined with the governor and the Speaker in urging that repeal some months ago at the time of the budget, not because I wanted to see a repeal and not because I didn't think the Ford bill was a very important legislative effort sponsored by my colleague at that time in the Assembly, Marlene Lynch Ford. But we were in desperate straits, and so I was willing to go along with it to accomplish a result. I still would be if, as Alan pointed out, we could demonstrate in what manner the monies would be spent. I wouldn't want to repeal that tax cut, especially not on top of the governor's proposed $250 million tax increase, unless I felt it were desperately needed to help solve the urban and suburban problem. If I can be assured of that, I'd go along with it again.
Right now, is there anything out there that you seem to be saying, based on what you've heard from some of the mayors, that there are going to be layoffs of police officers and firemen as a result of the lack of aid? Is there anything out there? Is there any initiative that you could propose to try to keep some of these people on their jobs?
Well, we already have. We've already indicated our support for Senator Russo's approach, which we are committed to once again. And the so-called mayor's program for the $145 million worth of aid, we support that. I think really the ball is in the Republicans' court. It's up to the governor to show some leadership. He talks about the politics of inclusion, but yet he seems to be freezing out the cities in the urban areas of the state. 35 mayors coming down here to hear hopefully some good news today and being sort of frozen out, both figuratively and literally. That doesn't speak well of that politics of inclusion. I think it's time for the governor to demonstrate and articulate where he is on this issue, as well as for Speaker Hardwick to articulate where he is on this issue, or whether the Republicans are just going to ignore this crisis.
I think what we've got to be careful of, and had some ominous signs today. You know, as you know, Larry, I personally have always been fond of the governor. We have a good personal relationship. We work together very well. But I sensed a partisanship in that speech today. I sensed that that speech reflected that this was an election year. And I hope I'm wrong, but I sensed that Tom Kean was putting politics ahead of the people of this state. I don't want to believe that. Perhaps as we get more into discussions of this, I'll realize I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, because I am fond of him personally. I think we now have to work together, forgetting there's an election. Keep partisan politics out of it. No finger pointing. Let's try to get together, but where we can't, respect the other's views. Let's compromise where we can, but let's rise above petty partisan politics. Tom Kean has an opportunity to make a mark in history. He's a popular governor. He's been a good governor as far as I'm concerned. I hope he doesn't undermine all of that now, just for the sake of petty partisanship to take over control of the Senate or whatever. New Jersey needs more than that. It expects more than that from Tom Kean. I know I do, because I think he's capable.
But is that really a realistic goal in an election year? I mean,
Why
let's
not?
face it, it is, I mean, this is a time of year where you say, I did this, and you didn't, or you didn't act on that. I mean, that's politics.
Where is it written that it has to be that way? You know, Tom Kean today talked about how we've accomplished so much last year without confrontation. Why can't we do that a second year? Isn't that really the best thing for me and Tom Kean and Alan Karcher and Chuck Hardwick to go back campaign time and say, we did our job? Why does it have to be that way? I'm determined that it shouldn't be that way. I hope that the governor will join with me and the speaker will and rise above that. It doesn't have to be.
Alan Karcher?
Well, I think the senator's absolutely right. There's no reason why we should sort of descend into petty partisan politics just because it's an election year. We have a busy agenda, not particularly the agenda the governor spoke about, but the agenda that is really on the people's minds in this state, starting with the cities. Solid waste, the garbage crisis has to be resolved. Division of Motor Vehicles has to be cleaned up. There's many needful things that have to be addressed. We should be able to address them, notwithstanding it's an election year. We ought to be able to do it on a bipartisan basis. We should roll up our sleeves and tackle the real problems. That's what we're elected to do down here. We're not elected to come down here and be cowards just because it's an election year. And we're not elected to come down here and just serve our party's interests. We're down here to serve the people's interests. And I think the state deserves that kind of government. I join with the senator. I saw that little hint of, that taint of petty partisanship creeping in today.
Where do you think it stood out most?
Well, I think that you have a part of what he outlined as the agenda. Part of what he did, for instance, with regard to, and I defer to the senator, of course, but when he mentioned that the Assembly, controlled by Republicans, had addressed this and that the Senate still remained with the Senate, I think the tone there could have been a little fairer and a little more balanced.
Especially,
Where did you think it was most partisan?
well, for example, I thought he avoided any mention of things such as civil service reform, which he touched upon, but about how we couldn't get this accomplished for years and years and years. And now here was a divided legislature with a governor, opposite party from the Senate. It got it done. He didn't extend that accolade as I thought he should have. When he pointed the finger on the insurance problem, that the Assembly, he said, acted in the public interest. Now it's up to the Senate to do so. The Senate has acted. It seems as though, unless we agree with him, he suggests we don't act in the public interest. It was just a little bit too, I thought, well, I don't know how else to put it, but partisan. I was disappointed. I would rather the governor take the position that, look, let's try to get together. If we can't, let's respect each other's views. Let's praise each other for trying our best, disagree though we might, and go on to the next issue. I got the impression today that the governor was less interested in accomplishing something on the insurance rate problem in the state and more interested on accomplishing nothing and then pointing the finger at the Senate and trying to translate that to Democrats when in fact it is Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. I just got that feeling, disappointingly so, that he was not prepared today to rise above partisanship as I thought he would be when I came here.
Gentlemen, on that note, we'll have to wrap it up. I'm afraid we're out of time. Senator Russo, Assemblyman Karcher, thank you for being with us this evening. I'm Larry Stuelpnagel. Thank you for joining us.